In this video I'm going to attempt to make a handheld cordless slot mortising machine using a Makita trim router and some scraps of wood and metal from around the workshop. I'm sure we'd all love a Festool domino machine for cutting mortises, but not all of us can afford one or justify the high cost. My build is highly inspired by Neil at Pask Makes' video where he made one quite recently. I'll put a link to that in the description box below, and this isn't a new idea. I think Stumpy Nub's channel made its own version of one of these machines, but for me the Pask Makes version was the one that really clicked with me and made me want to build one for myself. I haven't bought Neil's plans though, as I wanted the challenge of designing and making one for myself, but I do regret that decision and I'll talk some more about that at the end of the video. I won't be needing the router base for this project. There were a couple of extra bits that I needed to buy. First I needed to replace the original collet that comes with the router with this new 8mm one. This was only a few pounds on Amazon and I'll link to it in the description box. As you can see, it just pushes in place and is retained by the bolt. And the second thing I bought was this 35mm long 8mm wide spiral upcut bit, which will do the job of cutting the slot mortises. This bit was from Amazon too, and the price was around £23. Link in the description box for that too. The first job was to make the main case of the machine, so here I'm making the rip cuts at the table saw based on the dimensions from my drawing, and I made the cross cuts at the miter saw. And I'm using offcuts of 12mm hardwood plywood that I had spare for this. So here are what will be the front panel, the base panel and the two side panels. First I worked on shaping the side panels based on the dimensions from the drawing again. I used a speed square and an oil can to mark up the curves. I made the cuts at the bandsaw. And then I could glue and nail the side panels to the base panel. I made sure that the front edges were perfectly flush and then added glue and added the front panel. Once everything was held in place with brad nails, I added some clamps to get nice tight glue joints. To make the sliding mechanism for the mortiser, I needed some metal rods, and you can buy metal rod in whatever size you want. But as usual, I like to make use of stuff that I already have lying around, and I had this router guide from an old router that broke years ago. I just unscrewed the rods and then measured them up with my calipers, and these were 8mm in diameter. I cut them to length with my angle grinder, and they were a bit rusty and messy, so I cleaned them up with some sanding to make sure they were smooth. Next I went looking for some hardwood that I could use to mount the rods to, and I pulled out some offcuts of oak. Using the table saw and miter saw, I cut 4 equal sized pieces based on the dimensions from my drawing. The marks I'm making here are slightly offset from the centre, and I will explain the reason for that shortly. I used an awl to mark a hole at the centre of each cross. And then over at the drill press, using an 8mm drill bit, I drilled out both the holes in 2 of the pieces of oak. And I'm using a brad point drill bit to make sure that I'm centred to the holes that I made with the awl before drilling. Then I changed my drill bit to a 9mm brad point bit for both holes in the other 2 pieces of oak. So now I have 2 pieces with 9mm holes, which will be for the mobile carriage that runs on the rails, which slide pretty easily as you can see, and 2 pieces of oak with 8mm holes, which are nice and tight on the rods, and these will be the end stops. I marked them up at this point just so that I wouldn't get the pieces confused later. I also marked up the top of each piece with an X, and this is why I slightly offset the holes from the centre earlier. Here you can see that by orienting the 2 end stop pieces in the opposite way to the 2 carriage pieces gave me a couple of millimeters clearance so that the carriage pieces can move backwards and forwards on the rails, while the end stops can later on be secured to the base of the mortiser. Next I cut 2 pieces of 12mm plywood. The first will be a platform for the carriage, and it's just a simple rectangle, but it'd need a hole at one end right in the centre, and then I drilled a hole which will later accommodate a bolt. I was having some camera issues here, so apologies for the flashing. The second piece of ply will be used to make a pivoting platform that sits on top of the carriage and will later hold the router. This would have a hole in the centre too. I marked up the shape I wanted the piece to be. Then I marked up for some housing joints which will later be used to attach the router, and for that I'll be using some of these large hose clamps. I chose these because A, they'll hold the router nice and secure to the pivoting platform. B, because they're thin they won't take up too much space, which allowed me to make the mortiser slightly smaller. And C, they would allow me to maximise the pivoting motion to give a wider mortise cut if I ever needed it. I set up the crosscut sled at the table saw. I raised the blade to cut roughly a quarter of the way through the 12mm thickness of the board, and then I made a series of cuts to remove the material to form the grooves. I deliberately cut these grooves while the board was still square to make it easier to cut at the table saw, and then I could cut out the shape at the bandsaw. Both the carriage platform and the pivoting platform would need to be nice and smooth and hard wearing, so I applied a coat of spray varnish, and after waiting for that to dry I sanded it smooth with some 400 grit paper and then added another coat of the varnish. Next I could glue and nail the carriage platform to the carriage mounts. I left an overhang at the front as you can see, and I found that the 9mm holes had given me just the right amount of movement needed without any play, but I knew that if I did have some side to side play here, that I could always glue on some wood to the carriage mounts to remove the play from underneath, but I didn't have to. I used some super glue to stick some washers to the bottom of the pivoting platform, and using some 240 grit paper I wet sanded the face of the washers just to make sure that they were flush and nice and smooth. And it looked a bit like a face at this point. Hello! Then I added a bolt through the pivoting platform, through a washer, and then through the carriage base. And that got secured with a nut from the underside, and I tightened the bolt to remove any play but still keep a nice pivoting motion. And then I added a second nut to lock everything in place. The idea of using the washers was mainly to get a nice smooth motion and minimal friction when pivoting. Next I marked up another piece of 12mm ply which would be used to elevate the router and keep it sitting level on the platform. After cutting it to shape I glued it to the platform with some super glue. In order to get the carriage to push all of the way forward, I'd need to remove some material from the front end stop piece to make way for the bolt. I used a Forstner bit and chisels to do that, and here you can see that the carriage will now be able to slide all of the way forward. And in the end I found that I didn't actually need this extra bit of movement, but it's done now, so if I ever need that extra bit of cutting depth, I can do it. I could then add the sliding mechanism to the case, and I decided to secure this with just some screws without glue so that I can remove it later if I need to make any adjustments to it. I drilled pilot holes from underneath and added some screws through the oak end stops. I also drilled some pilot holes through the metal rods and added a couple of nails just to make sure they couldn't slide out of the end blocks. Next, using a piece of 25mm aluminium angle, I cut a piece to length that I could use to keep the pivoting platform from tilting forward. I marked up for some holes which I then drilled and countersunk. And then I could drill some pilot holes to the back of the carriage platform to secure it in place. It took a bit of sanding to the pivoting platform to get this working nice and smoothly, and then I could add the hose clamps to secure the router in place. At this point I turned the router on and made a plunge cut through the front panel to create a slot. And I checked to see if the slot was at 90 degrees to the edge of the panel, and it looked perfect. Then I pivoted the router to square up the bit to the front panel and made reference marks either side of the bit. And from there I could find the centre point, and I marked up some 10mm intervals from the centre. This allowed me to pivot the router lining up the bit with those marks, and then mark up lines onto the carriage platform to correspond to cutting a 40mm wide slot, a 60mm wide slot, or an 80mm wide slot. I could have gone wider still, but I don't think I'll ever need to. Next I wanted to make some pivot stops, so I first cut a piece of aluminium angle and then totally forgot how hot metal gets when you cut it. So I gave it a cold bath. I drilled a hole in it with a countersink bit, and then I could offer it up and screw it in place. I did the same for each of the three size settings, the 40, the 60 and the 80, and I did the same on the other side of the pivot platform too. Next I started making the fence for the mortiser, so I cut all the pieces at the table saw and cut some 45-degree brackets at the miter saw. The bottom of the fence would need to have a vision panel in it so that I'd later be able to see the reference lines for centering the mortiser to the line on the workpiece. So I marked up a shape for that and used a 10mm drill bit to create a clearance hole for the jigsaw blade so that I could cut out the shape. I assembled the fence with glue and brad nails. And then I checked for square and it looked bang on. Then I wanted to cut two slots in the front panel so that the fence could be made adjustable. I marked up some holes with an awl, drilled them out, marked up the slots, and then used the multi-tool to cut them out. And it always amazes me how accurately you can cut with one of these when you really want to. And here's yet another face.
Hello!
I needed to do a bit of filing to the slots so that I could fit a piece of threaded rod in. I wanted the rod to be a nice snug fit, not too tight, not too loose. And I'd already cut the heads off some bolts using my angle grinder to give me this threaded rod. And both ends of both rods got a washer and a wing nut so that I could easily hand tighten the fence to the front panel without using any tools. I then clamped on the fence to the front panel so that I could drill through the slots and through the fence to give me holes in the right place. I added the wing nuts and surprise surprise, another face appeared.
Hello!
So here's how the fence adjusts. And I can use my small square to make sure that it's parallel to the slot that will be cut. But I also decided to add some markings to the front panel so that I could easily set it to cut at 10mm intervals. Once those bolts were tightened by hand, it's really rigid, so that worked out nicely. I'd also need to make the fence non-slip, otherwise the force from pivoting the router bit left and right in the wood would cause the mortiser to slip, and that was a problem I had on a previous prototype. So on this one I used some rubber from an old bicycle inner tube. I scuffed up the bottom of the fence with some sandpaper to help get a better gluing surface, and then added some super glue. Then I added the rubber, stretching it out quite tightly, and I clamped a scrap piece of plywood on top to hold it flat. After the glue had set, I could trim off the excess rubber. This rubber was really grippy and it worked out really well. I decided to add a spring to the bars. This is another thing Neil from Pask Makes did on his version, and I wasn't sure if I'd do this, but then I found a spring from an old desk lamp in one of my drawers, so I thought I'd give it a try, and I think a little spring back is a good thing. I added my maker's mark to the case. Next I started working on making a handle, and I glued a couple of pieces of 12mm ply together, and using a hand plane I rounded over the front edge. I marked up a place for my hand to go and found the nearest Forstner bit to that size and drilled a couple of holes, and then I finished off the cuts with my multi-tool. Then I marked up some roundovers and cut those at the bandsaw. I could then glue and clamp the handle to the top of the front panel, and you can see here there's a slight overlap where the handle meets the back of the front panel to help get a bit of extra gluing surface for maximum strength. I cut another piece of aluminium angle to use as a maximum depth stop. This is pretty primitive, mainly because I expect most of the slots I'll ever want to cut will be full depth, so I don't expect to change the position of these regularly, but if I do ever need to, I can just screw them in further back. At this point I decided to cut my first slot. And that went reasonably well, and the slot looked really nice and clean. The final job was to mark up a centre point onto the fence. So I first used a square to set the bit as straight as I could, and then I could mark up the centre of the bit onto the fence. I could then mark a line on a test workpiece, line up the fence with that line, and cut a 40mm slot. To check if the centre line on my fence was accurate, I offered up my tape measure to the slot I'd cut, and I could see that it was quite far off. So I needed to adjust the line on my fence by about 2mm. And after that, I took another test cut and it was nicely centred. I just want to spend a bit of time talking about the good, the bad and the ugly about this project, in case you're thinking of making something similar. Because you might be thinking at this point that this looks like it's a pretty successful project, but I want to confess a few things. So first, the stuff that doesn't work well, and there are three things. Firstly, I wanted the router to be easily removable so I could use it as a trim router and then put it back in and use it as a mortiser again. But the problem is that when I put the mortiser back in, I found that the centre of the bit isn't always centred to the centre line on the fence. I had assumed that using the hose clamps would make it kind of self-centering, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I think that the plywood router mount that Neil at Pask Makes used on his is a better design than mine. Secondly, I was quite happy for my mortiser not to have dust collection, as it's only an occasional tool. I could just use it wearing a respirator and sweep up afterwards, or even just use it outside in the garden, seeing as this is a cordless tool. But what I hadn't anticipated was the amount of chips that would get down under the sliding mechanism, so after cutting each slot I kind of need to clear away those chips. On one of the previous prototypes that I made, I had added a dust collection inlet to one of the side panels, but that just wasn't really effective enough at collecting dust, so on the final version I decided not to bother. Again, Neil's mortiser design appears to deal with dust really effectively, but as I didn't have the right components to add that to mine, and also mine was designed to be used without dust collection, I'm not sure that I could add that retrospectively. And thirdly, it's not the most comfortable thing to use. I found that if I held the router when pivoting it, my finger would sometimes bash into the pivot stops, so I ended up holding it by the battery instead, which works okay, but I'm not convinced it's the best solution. I did think about making the pivoting platform extended with a handle on the end so I could hold that rather than the router itself. But to be honest, I'm now totally burned out with this project and I just don't have the motivation to experiment anymore with it. To be honest, I completely underestimated how difficult a project like this would be. Anything with moving parts is always going to be a challenge, but this one just became a burden to me to spend any more time on. Especially at a time when I have quite a lot of paid work to be getting on with that I was committed to doing, and other project ideas of my own that I was more excited by than this. It's not that this project takes a long time to build, you could easily build one in a day. It's the design part that's the real challenge, and I think the version I ended up with was the 4th version that I built. So that's probably 4 days I've got invested into it, and that's without all of the drawing and design work. And I still don't have a tool that works as well as I'd hoped. I do have a newfound appreciation though for tool designers. I had no idea how much work goes into making a tool ergonomic to use and perform well, and I already had a huge level of appreciation for Neil at Past Makes, but now that level of appreciation is even higher. It's not all bad though, and there were a few things that worked really well, and I'll talk about those things too. Using 12mm instead of 18mm plywood was a really good idea. I used 18mm on one of the previous prototypes, but because the Makita cordless router is pretty heavy, mostly due to the extra weight of the battery which is right at the back of the machine, that made it quite cumbersome to hold by the front handle. But using 12mm plywood and also making the fence have more surface area on the latest version made a huge improvement. The fence adjustment works really well, I like that a lot. The rubber that I added to the fence to make it non-slip works brilliantly. On one of my previous prototypes I didn't add anything to the underside of the fence as I didn't think it was needed. I figured I could just hold it down by the handle firmly, and boy was I wrong. So in summary, does it work? Yes. Is it perfect? No. Will I be using it in future projects? Maybe. Will I revisit it someday? Possibly when I'm less busy. Would I recommend building one like this? Probably not. Would I recommend building one like Neil's? Yes. If you want one, then you should watch his video and buy his plans. Would I recommend designing one for yourself? If you want a challenge, then yes, why not? But if you're anything like me, if I could have my time back again, I would have just bought Neil's plans and built that. I'm sorry that it's not as good and as complete a project as I had hoped it would be, but I hope that it was useful to you in some way, or at the very least I hope it was entertaining. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.